Okay. All right, so before we talk about water, actually, let me go to this next slide. There's a couple of things that you do need to understand. Don't worry about drawing this just yet, because you're not going to draw the whole thing. You're going to draw a simplified version of it, and that there's a box there. So let me just quickly make a couple of comments about bonding that you need to know before we get into the structure of water. First of all, basically you learned in chemistry, I hope, that there were two major kinds of bonds. You had ionic and you had covalent. What was the difference between them?
Ionic, like the bond, or one of them has like all the 8, right?
Yeah, one of them they end up with 8. They both kind of go along with getting 8, but one of them has to do with getting 8 by sharing, exactly, and the other one has to do with getting 8 by one taking electrons from the other. So does anybody remember which one shares? Covalent shares. But the truth of the matter is, everything isn't either ionic or covalent, because it's all based on electronegativity, which is how much an atom wants to pull electrons towards it. So if you have two things with exactly the same electronegativity, yes, you're going to have a perfectly covalent bond. They're going to be in a tug of war. Neither one is going to be able to take electrons from the other, and you're going to have perfect sharing. But most of the time, if you've got two different elements, their electronegativities are not going to be exactly the same, because every element has a different number of electrons. So there's this whole gray area in between where they share perfectly to they share not so perfectly, to where one of them has the ability to take from the other. So water is one of those where they're sharing, but it's the sharing that's not so perfectly. So if we look at it, what you need to know about water, the specifics as far as its structure and relating this to the bonds of water, you need to know that, first of all, it is covalent, but its structure is polar covalent. And that means that the sharing of the electrons is uneven. So in the case of water, and this is really the diagram that I would want you to know, and you don't have to draw all the little dots and things, it's really just an oxygen, a hydrogen, and a hydrogen. And it actually is bent. You don't have to know the actual angle or anything like that. But the idea is this: because oxygen's sort of a big bulky molecule, it tends to pull electrons towards it. And so even though it's sharing, it's sort of like if I was sharing a candy bar with you, but I basically took most of the candy bar and gave you a little piece. That's sort of what's happening here. They're sharing electrons, but the electrons are much more attracted to oxygen than they are to hydrogen. Now, what charge do electrons themselves have? A negative charge, which means that if the electrons are hanging around oxygen more, oxygen's actually going to end up with not a full negative charge, because that's what happens in ionic things, but a partial negative charge. And this little symbol here means partial. And the hydrogens are going to end up with partial positive charges. So they have a slight positive charge because the electrons are hanging around them a little less. And the oxygen has a partial negative charge because the electrons are hanging around it a little more. Sound familiar, I hope, maybe from chem or from bio? So that's called polar covalent, this uneven sharing. And we just said they have partial charges, which this symbol represents. The other thing is, though, opposites attract. So that means that if this has a slightly positive charge, it's going to be attracted to other things that have a negative charge. So anything that has a negative charge or a slightly negative charge is going to be attracted to these hydrogens. And anything that has a positive or slightly positive charge is going to be attracted to this oxygen. And so what ends up forming are these very weak, they call them bonds, but they're not even really bonds. They are actually just really strong attractions. And that's these over here, which you don't need to draw, but you should be familiar with what a hydrogen bond is. And this is also in that basic chemistry lecture online. So here's your hydrogen bonds here. And what's happening is that this water molecule is being attracted to all these other water molecules. Another place where you may have learned about hydrogen bonds would have been in DNA. I don't know how well you remember learning about DNA, but it was like this double helix, and then you had these bases in the middle, and like A connected to T, and T to A, and G to C, like that. And you may have remembered it being drawn with little dots, these little connections here being dots. They were also hydrogen bonds, thanks. So it's called a bond, but it's really more like Velcro, a very, very weak attraction. So this is not permanent. What's actually happening is these water molecules are sliding past each other. But when they slide past each other, they sort of get stuck just split second to each other. And so they get stuck and then they slide, and they get stuck and they slide. And this is going to give water some special properties. So your book donates an entire chapter just to the properties that water has. Because this structure, this whole polar covalent with the partial charges and hydrogen bonds, that's basically the key to what allows life to exist on this planet. All right, so properties of water. The first one is that water is an excellent solvent. So solvent has to do with making solutions. What's the other part of a solution besides the solvent? Right, the solute. So the solute is basically dissolved in the solvent. Water is called the universal solvent. It basically can dissolve more stuff than any other solvent that we know of. And in your bodies, for example, you've got a completely watery environment. Remember, you're made of like 60-70% water. Your blood is like 97% water. And so inside your cells, the environment inside and the environment outside, all watery. And so you've got all these ions floating around. In other words, dissolved substances that are floating around inside of your body. And that's going to allow all the reactions that occur in your body to keep you alive. Like cell respiration, like muscle contraction, like brain function, all of that stuff. Because it's polar, it basically dissolves anything else that's polar, as well as anything that's ionic. Remember, polar would have to do with having partial charges, and ionic would have to do with having full-blown charges. So any kind of salts are going to separate in water. And that's just a little diagram of just ionic stuff dissolving. By the way, anybody recognize in the picture on the left what that thing is going across the middle? Yeah, close. What did you say? It's yes, potassium. She said cell wall, but that's not quite cell wall. Cell membrane, plasma membrane. Well, you should say it louder. Cell membrane, which you may remember, is like semi-permeable. It lets some things through. The reason why is because the cell membrane is made out of phospholipids. Lipids, if you remember, fats and water don't mix. And so the cell membrane can control what goes in and out because it has the property of not liking water. Now, stuff that likes water is called hydrophilic, like philos, love, water loving. And again, that's most substances that we see in our bodies. Because almost everything that's going on in our bodies, these are ionic compounds or they're covalent compounds that are polar. Like even sugars are polar, even proteins have polar portions. So most of the chemicals that compose us are polar or ionic. Substances that are not polar, that don't like water, hydrophobic, which actually doesn't mean water hating. What would it mean? Do you know?
Afraid of water.
Right, afraid of water, like a phobia, a fear. The most common example of this would be lipids, fats, oils, even cholesterol, things like that. They don't like water. And they're important too, because like I said, the cell membrane, which has got lipids in it, it actually can act as a barrier, as a control. The fact that it's not crazy about water is what allows it to control what enters and leaves. This last little line here, you won't be tested on. So you don't have to, you can write it if you want to, but hydrophobic exclusion, it basically is just a term that refers to the fact that stuff that doesn't like water tends to glob together and separate from water. You don't have to know that term for a test or anything. Think about oil. If you have like oil and vinegar and you shake it up, the oil will separate into little bubbles, but then if you leave it there for a couple minutes, it'll just glob back together. And that's what they're referring to. Hydrophobic exclusion is the idea that covalent non-polar things will tend to glob together in water. Again, you won't be tested on that. Oh, and this PowerPoint, I'll have it online tomorrow, because tomorrow we'll finish it up. Second property that water has, we're going to call it stickiness. But the actual term for it, or terms, the scientific terms, would be cohesive and adhesive. I'm pretty sure you've heard these terms before also. Cohesive means water molecules stick to each other. It sticks to itself. And adhesive means it sticks to surfaces. It sticks to other things. Think about a waxed car. Wax is a type of lipid. And remember, water and lipids don't mix. So when you put water on a waxed car, what does it do?
Like beads off.
Right, it makes these like little beads, right? And it kind of runs off. Well, That's because the water molecules are cohesive, they stick to each other and form the beads, but they're not adhesive to the waxed car because it's a lipid surface. But they are adhesive, for example, to the little teeny tiny tubes inside of plants. Remember, plants need water, obviously, in order to survive. They can only absorb water at the roots. Even though people go around spritzing the leaves, that doesn't do anything. The leaves cannot take in water. What can take in water only is the roots, and then the water has to get from the roots to the leaves, which typically is against gravity. It's traveling up. What's going to allow it to do that is that as water evaporates, there's going to be this pull from the top, but the water is attracted to the sides, and the molecules of water stick together, and so they travel up the leaf. A good example of this that you've probably all seen is when they prick your finger to check your blood in the doctor's office, and they take that little glass tube and they touch it to the blood. It's so cool. And the blood just sort of gets sucked up the tube, magically. That's because blood is 97% water. And water molecules are polar, and they're attracted to each other, and they're attracted to the inside of the tube, and having such a tiny diameter, as a little bit gets sucked up, more of it follows. It wouldn't keep going till it spurts out the other side or anything, but that is why it travels up the tube. Another property of water that goes along with this is it has high surface tension, which basically means, what it sounds like, that the molecules on the surface stick to each other also. So you have almost this invisible film of water sticking to itself on the surface, and it resists being broken. Why is this important for living things? Well, for one thing, this is what allows, for example, little water striders and bugs like that to walk on the surface of the water. It ends up preventing water also from evaporating. You can lay a paper clip carefully on the surface of water. If you'd like, I'll give you a paper clip. You can go home today and try it. Paper clips on the surface of water, they'll sort of float there. They won't break through. And that's because of the surface tension of water. Not all liquids would do that. You could do a little science experiment. Put it on oil and put it on alcohol and put it on other things. And water has a very high surface tension. This is also why a belly flop hurts when you dive into the water and you land wrong. That's because the water resists your breaking through for a split second. If you do a belly flop from high enough, you'll die. It's like hitting a wall. Because that resistance, that split second of resistance, is going to prevent you from going through. And basically, if you're in a plane crash, the stewardesses are all, there's going to be an exit here, and the whole plane's going to be an exit. Because the water's going to rip the plane into pieces, because it's the surface tension of the water is that strong. So don't go flying this week after that story. But that's surface tension. The next characteristic of water is that it's a good temperature moderator. Basically, that means its temperature doesn't change very well. It basically helps to keep temperature stable. One of the reasons that I said that when they go and look at planets, they look for was there ever water there? Is it possible for water to exist there? Because water keeps temperatures in the right range for living things. Scientifically, we call this a high specific heat. A high specific heat means that water can absorb a lot of energy without actually getting hotter. You've experienced this, I'm sure, if you ever go swimming. In the spring, when it starts to warm up, well, it's kind of warm here all year, but in the spring, it starts to warm up, and it may be getting into the 80s outside, but your pool is still cold. That's because the water heat warms up extremely slowly. It resists temperature changes. This is important to living things, for example, that live under the water. I went to Colorado one summer. It was early June. In the daytime, it was like 80 degrees. At night, it was still dropping down to the 50s. So if you're an organism that lives on land, you would have to have some kind of a mechanism to warm and cool yourself. But if you live in the water, since water temperature changes very slowly, organisms in the water are protected. The temperature changes are going to be very minor, or they're going to be very gradual, and so this is going to protect the things that live in water. And the fact that we're made of water, and that means that the water temperature inside of us also changes very slowly, that's going to keep our temperature fairly stable. So that's going to protect living things from temperature changes. I don't know if there was something to write there. Everybody good? Metal has a very low specific heat. If you think about it, you put a pot on the stove with some water in it. After a minute, if you touch the bottom of the pot, you'll get burned. But you can still probably touch the water, and it's barely warmed up at all. Because the water is warming very slowly. It's absorbing the heat without getting hotter. Okay, so yesterday we stopped when we were talking about water having a high heat of vaporization, which meant that it took a lot of energy in order to convert it into water vapor. And then we also talked about water having a high heat of fusion, which meant it took a lot of energy. You had to remove a lot of energy for water to turn into ice. And I think I wrapped things up by showing you a little chart that under the conditions on Earth, water is basically a very stable liquid. So today we're picking up with the next property of water, which has to do with what happens when water freezes. And that is the fact that ice floats. When we think about ice floating, everybody pretty much knows that ice floats. But you may not have ever thought about the fact that that's actually extremely unusual. Because if you were to take, for example, a big iron block and melt it and drop a piece of solid iron into it, it would sink. If I was to freeze a block of alcohol and then drop that solid chunk of alcohol into liquid alcohol, it would sink. So it's very unusual. In fact, one of the very first things that you learn in chemistry is that solids are tightly packed, and then liquids are more spread apart, and then gases are really spread apart. So this sort of goes against that, because what actually happens is in water, ice is actually less dense than water. Solid water is more spread out than liquid water. Water is actually the most dense at about 4 degrees Celsius. At what temperature does it actually freeze?
0.
At 0 Celsius. So as it's dropping in temperature, it's actually getting more dense at first. But then when it gets to about 4 degrees, that's the most dense. What's going to happen is water, as it's cooling, is actually going to sink and bring warm water up. So in one way, organisms are going to be protected because the water's going to keep moving. It's going to keep the temperature balanced. But then, even when the water in the top layer does start to cool below 4 degrees, and now it's getting lighter and it ends up at the top, that means that the lake is actually going to freeze from the top down. Ice is going to insulate the organisms underneath and form a layer on the top. If it was the other way around and ice sank, then what would happen is you would end up with a lake freezing from the bottom up, which would mean that all the organisms would freeze. So the fact that it freezes on the top and floats is actually a good thing, because now it's going to protect the organisms that are under the water.
Isn't the water still freezing?
It's cold, but it's not freezing.
Frozen.
Right, and the thing is, in your cells too, if we take a cell like cryogenics and we try to freeze it, if the cell actually freezes, what ends up happening is ice is very sharp. So when it starts to freeze, you get these little sharp shards of ice, and then and when you defrost them, like they try to do with mice or whatever, the shards of ice have poked holes in all the cells, in all the cell membranes. So then even when you defrost them, they don't survive. So the fact that ice floats is going to keep everything else just above that freezing temperature. So even if it's a cold-blooded organism, it's going to cool, but not to the point where it would actually freeze. So that's really important. Organisms that live in places where it's colder than freezing, actually we've discovered, you may know this, that they actually have a like an antifreeze, the equivalent of antifreeze in their system, so that their temperature can actually go below 0 without forming ice. And that's actually, if we were going to go into the whole cryogenics thing, that's actually what they're thinking about, is could we inject something that would be non-toxic that would allow the cells to get that cold that everything slows down and you could put them into preservation, but without forming those sharp shards of ice that would then puncture the cells when you defrosted them. So this this next thing is actually an explanation of why ice floats. So in order to understand this, we have to go back for a second to the structure of water. So if you remember water structure, what kind of bonds hold a single molecule of water together? These little sticks here, what kind of bonds are those?
Hydrogen.
Not hydrogen, be careful. These bonds. I thought I heard somebody say that.
Covalent.
These are covalent, not just covalent, but the uneven type of, very good. The uneven type of covalent, which is called, I heard somebody just say it, polar covalent.
Yes.
And because of that, we end up with these partial charges. This is our oxygen. What kind of partial charge does it have?
Partial
Positive or negative?
Negative.
Partial negative charge, because oxygen has all those electrons around it, and then our two hydrogens end up with these partial positive charges. And that's what causes the attractions between them, and that's the hydrogen bonds. The thing is, in liquid water, if we imagine this is a hydrogen bond between one water molecule and another water molecule, what's going to happen here is that this bond is going to form, but it's really, remember, like Velcro. It's just a strong attraction. It's going to form for a fraction of a second, and then it's going to break. And then the water's going to form it with another one. So when that bond breaks, here's the thing. When this bond breaks, this can now slide past, and they can get very close to each other. And then another one forms, and then it breaks, and they slide past. So when the hydrogen bonds form, yes, it's causing them to kind of stick together, but it's causing them to stick together at a specific distance. In other words, a hydrogen bond has a certain length to it. Here. Oops, here. And that's basically as close as they can get when it's hydrogen bonded. Now in a liquid, it doesn't matter, because like I said, those bonds are lasting for a fraction of a second, and then the molecules are sliding past each other. But what's going to happen when it becomes ice is that these hydrogen bonds are going to lock in place. So believe it or not, even though it's going to freeze into a block, what's actually going to happen is the hydrogen bonds are going to force it. When it freezes, the molecules are actually going to be slightly further apart than if it was a liquid and those bonds were being made and broken and the molecules were sliding past each other. And this is why if you leave a soda in the freezer for too long, it explodes. If you do it with water bottles, same idea. When you do it with a water bottle, you may come back and find the bottom of your bottle's all bulged out. It won't stand up anymore. And that's because solid water actually takes up more space than liquid water does. And so, which is a very unique property. And like I said, in the case of life, it insulates organisms below the surface when water freezes on the surface of lakes and things like that. So, any questions about property of water? Okay. This is just showing a diagram. You don't have to know that there's a honeycomb structure, but this is the honeycomb structure they're referring to, that when those hydrogen bonds lock in place, the water molecules are sort of forced further apart than if they could actually slide past each other. And this diagram, I don't know if you've ever seen phase change diagrams in chemistry. You might have. This is basically showing different combinations of temperature and pressure. Pressure for us on this planet right here, this is where we are. We're at sea level, so it would be around here. And then water on this planet is going to be somewhere between typically 0 and 100 degrees. Hopefully it's not 100 Celsius anywhere, because that's boiling. But the bottom line is, if you notice that basically on the conditions of our planet, water is the perfect liquid. It's a liquid, in all of this range. On another planet, it might all be frozen or it might all be gas. But on our planet, it's a liquid because of its structure. Okay. This last section on the pH scale is actually coming from the notes above the water notes. If you slide back to basic chemistry, I did this online, but I did such a very, very quick explanation of it that I wanted to go over it again. So if you go to the paragraph just above water, and it talks about pH from the basic chemistry lecture, that's where we're at right now. So pH scale. In chemistry, particularly if you take AP chemistry, you have to learn a lot about pH, and you have to actually understand how a log works on your calculator, and you do a lot of calculations with pH. In here, you don't have to know all of that. All you really need to know is that even though water is covalent, polar covalent, little bits of water do break up on a very, very, very small scale. And if water breaks up, we can write water not just as H2O, but you could write it this way. You could write it as HOH. Now acids, which is coming up in a few minutes, acids tend to make hydrogens in solution. So acids, something like hydrochloric acid, when you put it in water, it releases a bunch of H's. And that's what causes the pH change, the pH below 7 making it an acid. And bases tend to do the opposite. They tend to either pick up hydrogens or they release hydroxide, OH. The thing is, since water is HOH, even if a water breaks, you're not going to have an increase in hydrogens without an increase in this also. In other words, when water breaks up, it's not going to make an acid or a base because it does both. It makes a hydrogen, which is what acids do, but it also makes a hydroxide, which is what bases do. So water, even though it can break up a little bit, is completely neutral. And that's where we get our neutral pH from. So here's what you need to know, or the first thing you need to know. What is pH? Well, it's calculated using the log function on your calculator. It's the negative log of the hydrogen concentration. The good news for our class, you're not going to need a calculator. You don't even actually have to understand what a log is. Okay, so you don't have to understand log because in our class, if you're asked for the pH of something, they're going to give you a hydrogen concentration that's a whole number. So in this particular case, the hydrogen concentration is 10 to the negative 7th. To get the pH, all you do is just take this exponent, and that's your pH. And that's what you need to know about if I gave you a hydrogen concentration, how do you get the pH from there? In chemistry, you would do it, you may need a calculator to do it, but for the purposes of what we're doing, you don't. So pH is just going to be the negative log. So what if the hydrogen concentration was 10 to the negative third? What would the pH be?
3.
The pH would just be 3. Really simple. So it's just the exponent, that's going to be your pH. Now, you probably learned, hopefully, at some point, that the pH is based on a scale of 1 to 14, and neutral is 7, and below 7 is an acid, and above 7 is a base. But one of the things that people don't quite always have a handle on is this. What does pH really mean as far as relating it to hydrogen concentration? If it's measuring how many hydrogens there are in a solution, how do we know exactly numerically what that's going to be, and how is that going to change? So the thing is, when the pH goes down by 1, the hydrogens increase by 10. For example, let's say we went from a pH of 7 to a pH of 6. Well, remember that pH was the negative log of the hydrogen concentration. So that means the hydrogen concentration of this would have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The hydrogen concentration of this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is actually a bigger number. The hydrogen concentration actually went up even though the pH went down. So if you were trying to figure in your head why is the pH going down but the hydrogens are actually going up, because remember, pH is sort of a shortcut. You don't have to know this as far as calculating, but if I do tell you that the pH changed from, let's say that I tell you the pH changed from 10 to 8, and I ask you by how much did the hydrogen concentration go up, what do you think?
20%.
Sometimes I hear 2, sometimes I hear 20. Neither one of those is right, by the way. 100.
Oh.
Here's the thing.
Close.
We went from 10 to 9, so it increased by 10. When we go from 9 to 8, it increases by 10 again, meaning the decimal is going to move 2 places. It's actually increased by 100. So that's what you have to know, is that when I say that every drop raises the number of hydrogens by 10, I could say, oh, the pH goes from this to this, by how much does the hydrogen concentration go up? You need to know that all you're going to do is just count the jumps and multiply by 10, because it's going to be 10 times 10 times 10, and that's how much it's going to go up. If you're going the other way, that's how much it's going to go down. Hydrogen goes up, hydrogen goes down as the pH goes up. Does that make sense? Okay.
This is on your video on YouTube, right?
This is, I'm making it now. Your voice will now be in it. Yes. So touching. All right. At 7, we have neutral. Below 7, it's an acid, and above is a base. Most people already know that. You do need to know that. So acid and base, and that the drop goes up by 10, and that the definition is the negative log of the hydrogens. And the very last thing that you need to know, and then I'll show you how I could apply this information, is that pH and pOH add up to 14. So here's an application question. Here's what I might actually ask you on a test. I could give you 4 choices. I could say we have a pH of 4, choice 2, a pOH of 12, choice 3, a hydrogen concentration of 10 to the negative 6, and choice D, an OH concentration, a hydroxide concentration of 10 to the negative, let's say, 10.
Oh.
Sorry. And then I can say, which of those is the strongest acid? That's my question. Which of those is the strongest acid? Well, here's the thing. If you want to know which one's the strongest acid, I hear some people saying C, you need to put all of those in the form of pH, because we know that as the pH goes down, that's a stronger acid. So whichever one has the lowest pH is going to be our answer. So we already have the pH on this one. The pH on this one is 4. The pH and the pOH add up to 12. So what's the pH on B?
2.
So the pH on B, oops, I meant to do that in pen. Yes. The pH on B is 2.
It adds up to 4.
How about on this one? The pH on this one is 6. And now what about this one? 4, because if the OH is 10 to the negative 10, that means the pOH is 10. Since pH and pOH add up to 14, the pH would be 4. So which one of those is our strongest acid?
B.
Choice B is actually our strongest acid. I think you said C.
No, that was
Yeah, we'll play it back
That
and
was
see.
me.
Wait, Miss
I
Solvent,
said-
why